All right, so we are streaming again. I'm gonna send out the link again here because apparently nothing can be easy tonight. But you should be able to be heard now, Chris. Chris Watkins is here.
Yo, yo, yo. Hi, everyone.
So I'll just pop the link in the old one. And hopefully people will join us here. Because this is a crazy start. But yeah, so let's start with the game, I guess. Well, you know what? Let's talk about the game after because I think the most immediate thing that we need to talk about is the kerfuffle that went on while the game was going on. Which we'll start out with the Scott Mellenby stuff.
Yeah.
Scott Mellenby, according to Pierre LeBrun, interviewed with Jeff Molson for the GM job, which says writings on the wall. Marc Bergevin's not coming back, so that's
Right.
done. And he also wanted to be president of hockey ops, and apparently was told no on both, and then resigned. Can you remember the last time any outside of the Rangers last year, or was that during the season that the Rangers had the resignations last year?
No, I think that was after the season, if I remember correctly, the timeline. Because you're talking about John Davis. I think John Davidson resigned in season, and then
Yes, yeah.
Drury was after. So yeah.
Yeah, so this is I can't remember another time where a member of management resigned from a team in season. It wasn't like to immediately take a job somewhere else.
Yeah. No, or more specifically, not under fire from some scandal of
Yes.
some sort. But yeah, it's a very rare situation, obviously, because to your point, generally you're doing that either involuntarily or with the intention of moving onto a better position. And obviously, most teams aren't hiring at this point in time. So yeah, it's a very risky proposition for Scott Bellenby, but you know, clearly he felt very strongly, or he saw the writing on the wall and decided to make the move before it was made for him. So
Yeah, because I mean, when you're meeting with the owner of the team, who is currently the president of hockey operations, which is a big a thing here, like that people talk about all the time, that he probably shouldn't be,
right,
and continues to prove that he shouldn't be. But when also, I think Elliot Friedman said on the broadcast that Marc Bergevin suggested Scott Mellenby to be the next GM. It was his recommendation. So if Mellenby is the guy that the
right.
last guy who's probably leaving is recommending, and the owner is saying not happening, that
Right.
signals a change in direction, right? Like that. Aside from the whole francophone thing, I don't know if Mellenby can speak French. He
Sure.
might. I don't know. But aside from that, to me, that says that Marc Bergevin is not calling shots right now.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is an indication that um, that ownership wants to see something else. Maybe not the entirety, and if you're a pro you're a pro Bergman fan for some reason, you can maybe hold out hope that there's still some likelihood that they'll bring him back, but with a different sort of set of leadership underneath them. Which you often see with like coaches where they'll fire the assistants, but allow the coach to sort of stay on board to see if they can bring them back. So I remember this was a situation with the Blackhawks with Joe Quenneville, and I think they fired Kevin Dineen, and Quenneville wasn't happy about that, and that eventually was a precursor to Quenneville leaving or being shown the door as well. So, um, yeah, I mean, I would probably lean towards Mark Bergevin not coming back if I had to put money on it, but I would have put money on him not being allowed back in the first place anyway, like quite some time ago. So yeah, I mean, I think for the future long term direction of the franchise, like I don't think it's a Mark Bergman is a talent that you need to sort of bend over backwards to try to keep happy, in my point of view.
Yeah, I would, especially on an expiring contract, right? Like he doesn't have a lot of sway in the future, I would assume. Although he did sign a bunch of long-term contracts,
Yeah.
fairly recently. So
Yes.
it's not quite as bad as the whole Pete Chiarelli signing Koskinen to a multi-year deal 30 hours before he was fired, but Mark Bergevin definitely had the reins fully
Right.
entering this season, but it seems like now that's pretty much not happening. So the
Right.
writing appears to be on the wall that there's going to be a change at the head of the Montreal Canadiens, and they got permission to talk to, not about, Jeff Gorton. And this is really exciting for me because I know that you've been a huge critic of Jeff Gordon and the job he did with the Rangers for various reasons.
Right.
And I saw like a lot of people pointing out his like short stint with the Bruins, right? And like for good
Sure.
reason.
Sure.
I think you could argue like not many people have gotten as much done in one summer as Jeff Gordon did with the Bruins that year, but that was also a long time ago.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, and it's also, what I think I ran through the three top things that sort of make or break a GM, which is somebody else building up a core for you, getting draft luck and having cap space.
Yeah.
Uh and a lot of those, and for Gordon, he had the magical fourth one, the sort of work whistle, which was being located in New York, which get to know Adam Fox, the hometown boy that sort of moved heaven and earth to come home, and then Artemi Panarin, who was dedicated to being in a big market, and then in theory Jacob Trouba as well. So three of your biggest acquisitions were sort of based off the fact of your location, and so this is a similar sort of issue with like the Lakers in the NBA, where it's like, okay, how good is the gym?
Yeah.
Because it's literally LeBron just wanted to be someplace sunnier than Cleveland, and LA made the most sense. But yeah, so I mean that's part one of it. I mean, I think part two is my main critiques of Gordon are this: like they obviously lucked into the Kako draft, like that's fine, that happens every year. Philadelphia moving up to get Nolan Patrick and all that stuff like that. Like teams move up in the draft every year. That's something that happens. The ability to get Alexis Lafreniere during the bubble year was just completely asinine to me, and I hated that the league did it. The Blackhawks were in perfect position to get it. I think the Canadians were as well, and the fact that the incentive was for, if you make the playoffs, you don't get in the second lottery, made zero sense to me whatsoever. Because if you're one of those down on the luck teams, you are incentivized to want your team to lose, so then that way you can get a top pick. And the Rangers being gifted that, and then still not knowing how to build around that very fortuitous gift of the number one, first overall. It was like I mean, I've been out in Gordon for a while just because I don't believe he had a sense of direction. And so, if Canadians fans are frustrated by Mark Bergevin, I don't think they'll find salvation in the arms of Jeff Gordon.
I feel like if you're trying to look for like a positive to spin it,
Sure.
could you say like how much of the directionless uh nature of the Rangers where like they talk about going into a full rebuild, and
Sure.
then was it even a full season later that they signed Panarin? And it's like it's hard to turn down a guy like Panarin, but at the same time, like if you're trying to go into a full rebuild, you probably don't want to be signing like an $11 million contract on a guy
Right.
in their like edge of the prime, right? And like how much of that could have been like John Davidson,
Correct.
who
Yeah. And
has his
yeah.
thumb on the scale as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is a common refrain for the Blackhawks as well. That John McDonough, Stan Bowman couldn't do what he really wanted to do because John McDonough was, only focused on the business and all that stuff like that. And obviously, like with all the off the ice stuff that sort of resulted from that power structure, that's definitely not something that you want to see replicated. But even with the on ice stuff, the concern was that, or the reporting was at the time, that the Blackhawks couldn't do a full rebuild because the sellout streak was very important to upper management and the ownership. And so for Jeff Gordon, yeah, obviously like that sort of looming figurehead in the back that has the owner's ear and sort of can make or break your regime is definitely critical. To your point, it's very hard to pass up a player like Panarin. There's not that many quality free agents that come onto the market in the first place. The fact that a player like Panarin on the right team can bring you championship equity and put you over the top with the right roster construction. Like, yeah, I can understand that. I think my biggest issue was not even that. Like, I think they paid a little bit too much for Panarin, given the fact that he wanted to come in. But that was fine. It was the sort of other stuff around it that was more problematic to me. I'm signing Jacob Trouba to the $8 million contract. Even in the best case scenario, people probably didn't predict him falling off like he did without Dustin Bufflin and Josh Morrissey, but that's probably a little bit rich for him. Chris Kreider, who's having a great season this year, but you sort of look 2 or 3 years down, that contract's probably not going to look great. Not being able to pull the trigger on Jack Eichel last year, probably before he got injured, which probably screwed both the Rangers and the Sabres because Jack Eichel basically broke his back in the game for the Sabres. And maybe had he been on a team that was more competent and didn't need him in that position, you're probably talking about, still peak Jack Eichel. So I think there was a lot of sort of sliding doors that came as a result of that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, like, the Rangers are playing very well right now, and you definitely have to give credit somewhere. Like somebody had to acquire those players, but I think what the team could have been, and I think that's been my biggest complaint, is that the opportunity cost where you could have
Yes.
made the 2010 Blackhawks or the 2017 Lightning or some team that's stacked with talent where you have your still in their prime veterans or still contributing veterans, plus there's just a wave of up and coming talent, and then some cap space to add in like a Brandon Saad sort of trade. Like that could have been them, and then you're talking about a perennial contender. What they probably have sort of run themselves into is probably a really good team that could probably make a conference finals run, maybe even like a long shot Stanley Cup run. But this is probably, I don't see a team that's going to be competing for the next, 4 or 5 years from now, and may potentially go on a dynastic run. And that's very impossible for a lot of teams to do. But this team had a chance to do that, but you had to sort of hit all the right things. And I felt like he was too 50-50 to sort of make that happen.
Yeah, and that honestly sounds very familiar to Mark Bergevin. And for the Rangers, it's unfortunate because what you just described is exactly what they were when they
Right.
had Prime Lundqvist, right? They were a team that was like just good enough to make a couple of those like really decent runs, but never actually get to the promised land.
Right.
There's a comment here on the YouTube chat, which like obviously I can't host the show and look at Twitter, but TVA reporting they're the rights holder here in Quebec for the Montreal Canadiens that Marc Bergevin learned about these developments at the same time as everyone on Twitter. That's that's rough. That's rough because like not only is that rough from like his job security standpoint, like him and Jeff Molson have a 10-year relationship.
Sure. Yeah.
That's I don't know. I mean, I think that it is time for a change, as I've said repeatedly on this show and on everywhere else that I talk and write for years now. But that's a tough one. It's similar to the whole Vegas situation with Fleury in the
Right.
offseason, right? Where you had Alan Walsh talking about how they didn't even tell Fleury that he was on the
Right.
trade block, and they were like, "No, we did." And it was like, but it seems like they didn't, and I get it to an extent. Like being cutthroat is something that you don't see enough of in the NHL,
Yeah.
but also there's like that base layer of respect that you're like, you always talk about, like, you always see people talking about like, oh, hockey people are the best people. And it's like, they're not though. Are
But
they?
I mean, that to me, but even from that perspective, sort of being cutthroat, like you can still be so you can still be cutthroat, but like there's some people
Transparent.
that I guess live for that, where they, just like, I'm gonna come in and just be a jerk and fire everybody and all that stuff like that. Who cares what other people think of me? And what you often hear like players say this about coaches, was like, I like that coach because even though that they were a jerk, I always knew where I stood with them. They might say you're the worst player ever, but when I was good, they would tell me like, yeah, you played great today, but you're still like the worst player ever. But you had a great game today. Like, it was always like very cut and dry. And people respect that. What
Yeah, it's like Tortorella, right? The way players talk about
exactly.
him.
Exactly. So yeah, exactly. And so from that perspective, it's like, okay, yeah, you can be like, yeah, this is what it is, it's really hard. More than likely not gonna bring you back, so on and so forth. Um, and as an owner, you have the power, like the GM can't do anything without your approval. It's not like he's going to go out and trade, Nick Suzuki, for a 7th round pick just to spite you. Like he can't do that without your approval. But from that perspective, like unless it is something that you are like replacing him and trying to find that replacement and like internally and don't want to let that person know about it per se, like to me it is very it's very facetious to be like, oh yeah, we're gonna be cutthroat and cold hearted and do all this, but then also be like very secretive about it. Like either just own it and say like, yeah, this is how we're rolling with it, or not. Going back to Columbus, I feel like Yarmo's that way, where it's like, yeah, we did this, but I'm gonna let you know why and tell you why. And I think people can respect that. They may not agree with it, but yeah, sort of doing both of them is sort of like two-faced, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I'm totally with you. I think that if you're gonna do the cutthroat thing, you gotta own it. You gotta stand up in
Yeah,
front
you
of
gotta own it. Yeah,
the podium or stand in the person's office or have them come to your office and tell them what you're doing. You don't have to be nice about it, but
right,
you gotta be forthright. You can't
right.
hide, and that's a little bit disappointing and part of the problem. I think like it's indicative of maybe how this organization has been run for the
Yeah,
last, you know, decade plus that Molson's been in
right.
charge, and unfortunate. I guess we should probably talk about the game a little bit. We'll probably circle back to this news as well because there's a lot of chaos going on right now. But I think the one guy that really stood out to me outside of Jake Allen in that first period and through the rest of the game was Josh Anderson.
Yeah,
And he
yeah,
talked before the game about how like the leaders on the team, the older guys on the team have to be a lot better. And I was on with Shireen Ahmed episode was just last night, and we were talking about how Anderson has a tendency where when he thinks that he has to be the guy, he's
yeah.
very like individualistic, and you simultaneously love the guy who thinks they want to be the guy that to break the game open, but also when they don't have the ability to do
Right.
that, like a McDavid, when they do it over and over again, they often get caught. But I thought he hit that balance perfectly tonight, where he was physical, he was engaged, he
Right.
was pushing play, he had some nice defensive plays. Maybe Josh Anderson's best game as a Montreal Canadian.
Yeah, I mean, and that's always the hard part, one about hockey overall as a sport, which is like, LeBron comes back from injury and the team's not playing well and all that stuff like that. It's like, okay, I'm gonna, dominate my matchup and I'm gonna take, 15 shots in the fourth quarter and make a defensive play, and just exert more energy than I normally would in this situation, because my team really needs it. And so you can sort of do that. A pitcher in baseball can be like, hey, it's the bottom of the ninth. I got to get this guy out and get the shutout. I'm gonna put a little gas on this pitch or whatever or something like that. Um, and hockey is a little bit harder for an individual to try to take over the game without
100%.
doing something that breaks the system. A player trying to do too much and dangle through seven, through four defenders or whatever, unless they're McDavid, it's probably not going to end well. It's probably going to end with a very primo chance going the other way. And so, from that perspective, uh, I think your point is valid. Where the best way you can do that and impose your will on the game is to bring that energy from the opening, puck drop. Bring that physicality. And Josh Anderson is a really interesting use case. Like I didn't agree with the contract that they gave him. One, because I was surprised that Bergevin gave him so much leverage. Like, if you're gonna trade for me, I need a 7-year contract and nothing. I'm gonna be a rental.
Yep.
Um, and I didn't think he was good enough for all that. I was like, all right, we're gonna make you a rental then. But with that being said, he particularly at his peak in Columbus was the exact version of the sort of power forward with the speed that all the teams are looking for now. Like he was in like the 95th percentile in both power and speed, in my metrics, and he fell off a little bit. That's actually what made him available in the first place. He had the one goal and sort of had a bounce back season last year. But if he can bring that effort every single night, then you're a team that's not in the situations that you are normally in, that they've been in this year, where you're sort of falling behind because that energy is contagious. It sort of brings everyone else, and forces them to step their game up. And if Anderson, he's not going to be able to score. He doesn't have the skill set to, score on a regular basis, but just bringing that regular effort and intensity, that's something he can do and is capable of, but he just hasn't done it on a consistent basis, particularly with the Canadians, since he's been there.
Yeah, I wonder if it's one of those situations where because he's counted on to be that physical guy that, like, just managing an 82 game season, you can't do that every night, right? Like, I think this season he's been more consistent than he was last season, but there's still games where you don't really notice him, and when he does, like, show up, it's just his usual, like, gun down the wide wing there and try to cut in at the last minute, and oftentimes he's just edged out and either goes behind the net or goes, like, straight into the net,
Right.
and
Yeah.
he's not a talented enough passer to take advantage of his line mates for the most part on
Right.
those rushes. Although he has made some pretty decent passes this year, which did not exist at all last season. I believe last season, or it might have been last season or the one before, he had like the worst passing metrics in the entire league among forwards. It was really bad. It was really bad. So he has shown a lot of improvement. I think he was, especially since the Penguins made a push late. Like, I think Allen was the first star of the game because of the way he held that first period steady. But at the end, do you give it to Josh Anderson as the player of the game? He kind of closed the game out with the empty netters too. Like,
Yeah.
he was huge tonight.
Yeah, I mean, I think I saw he was like had 11 shots, shots today or something like that. I still would give it to Jake Allen only from the perspective of, they're not in a position for Josh Anderson to put him over the top if it's not for Jake Allen sort of holding for long enough, particularly in
100%.
the first 2 periods. So that's probably where I have to give it, because that's all you want your goalie to do is to put you in a position to win. I was talking about this with some Sabres fans the other night, which is like based off the 32 thoughts column, talking about, they're looking for a goalie because they're not even in a position to win. They're not even in a position to compete, and it's hard to evaluate your young players in that scenario because you're already down 3-0 after the first 10 minutes. The Blackhawks had the same issue at the beginning of the year, which is they're down, giving up a goal in the first 4 minutes, like 4 out of the first like 5 games or something like that. So the fact that Jake Allen was able to hold it for long enough for the team to still be in it, despite the fact that they were badly outshot for most of the game, probably have to give it to him.
Yeah, yeah, I'm with you there. I feel like that it's so important to not get behind early, and like part of that is on the team obviously as well. But if your goalie's letting in bananas everywhere, like,
Right.
I don't want to like get too down on like Sam Montembeau, but he's just not at this level, right?
Sure.
And it's been a rough scene, and even Jake Allen, when he gets tired, like, you can tell when he's not ready for a game because
Right.
the things happen for him, and it doesn't work out very well. There was a comment here that I actually want to touch on because I think it's something that I kind of go back and forth on a little bit. It was Jonathan Convoy. He was saying that well put by you, Chris, because hockey is often a weak link game, and I think that's true. But I feel like it's one of those tough situations because it's almost both, which makes no sense. But then you see guys like McDavid who can single-handedly, like, it's like it can be a strong link game if the guy that you have is generational, but every other time it's a weak link game.
Yeah, so I just had this conversation not a few minutes ago. What I think it is, it's either or. And this exact scenario I'm talking about is, you can use whatever metric you want, but let's just set a baseline. Like you can say, uh, at a very base level, like, I think the average team scores 220 goals. So can my team get over 240 goals or something like that? Like if you want to have a plus, the a championship contender has like a plus 40 goal differential or something along those lines. So to get there, it's like, okay, well, we're an average defensive team, but we're scoring 260 goals. Okay, we can get there, or we can be, the other way around, where we're average offensively, but we're only allowing 180. And so it's the same thing when we talk about roster construction, which is like, I say set a baseline of 20 WAR for your team. That's in like the top 10 teams in the league. And if you get there, then you can focus on, well, I want this particular type of roster, or I want this particular type of player, or I want stars and scrubs, or I want, fully balanced. But can you fit 20 WAR underneath the salary cap for the next X amount of years? And if you can, then you should, be in the Stanley Cup conversation every year. And so when it comes to a team like the Oilers, if 20 WAR is the baseline, well, McDavid's already offering you 6, and then Drysdale is offering you 5. So you're like halfway there with 2 players. The problem is finding the other players to get you above that threshold, and
And not having too many guys that bring you back down below.
exactly right. Yeah. So not having negative guys, having enough players to fit you under that threshold. Because McDavid and Draisaitl are so valuable, they're going to take up a significant portion of your salary cap. And then the other key part of it, and one of the reasons I've been, one of the few advocates of breaking them up, as amazing as they've been, is because if you don't eat, you have the 11, you're trying to get to 20, and you're stuck at 17. It's very hard to sort of close that gap with how good they are, because you're not going to build through the draft. You don't have the cap space to acquire somebody through free agency. They did get Zach Hyman, but they had to give up, Adam Larson and other players to sort of get him. So you're sort of still at that same sort of like below that threshold, and then you don't have the assets to trade for someone in that capacity either. So like, how do you cross that threshold? And so you can contrast it with the St. Louis Blues of a few years ago, which is more of a balanced lineup, or even last year's Canadiens, which is like, yeah, we're not paying anybody, well, none of our skaters like $10 million a year, but we're going to be so deep and be able to run out 4 lines because everyone is between $3 million and $7 million, but they're all really good players that can contribute in different ways. So I think it just really depends on the composition of your team and what you have available to you. But until you have that sort of threshold, you should be doing everything you can to get across it.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, is hockey the only sport that's like that, though, that can be both? There's a comment here saying, is it just a weak link sport, but Connor makes the other team a weak link? I mean, yeah, it's not really how it works, but it's kind of also how it works.
Well, yeah. So going back to McDavid, as people that follow me on Twitter might have seen my fun comments on both of the Oilers all-time greats and Wayne Gretzky and Connor McDavid. I mean, Connor is an amazing player. When you see like his playoff performance, it's still amazing. Still like top 5 billion, like points per 60. I think he's like 6th in like the past 3 or 4 years. In that situation, because so much is put up on him. You see this in the NBA as well, where it is a strong link game, but it's like strong link plus like really good, like not as strong links, but having being surrounded. So LeBron by himself cannot win a championship.
Right.
Steph Curry or Kevin Durant by themselves cannot win a championship. They often have really good players surrounding them to sort of get them over the top, because once you get to the Final Four, all of those teams have equivalent players that can, they might not be LeBron all 82 games, but they can be LeBron for like 7-game series. And so it's the same thing with Connor McDavid, which is, he gets into the 7-game series, and like, yes, he individually is amazing, but the things that he is required to do, teams have a better chance of stopping that, obviously, with the playbook being thrown out basically in the playoffs and all of that stuff like that. So that's a key component of it. But even still, like the fact that with the constraints that Connor McDavid faces, also the same constraints that everybody else faces as well. It probably affects him more just because of how reliant like the Oilers are on the power play, but that also speaks to a weakness of their overall team. It's the same thing that befell the Bruce Boudreau Capitals and the Bruce Boudreau Anaheim Ducks and the Bruce Boudreau Minnesota Wild, which is like they would dominate special teams and all of that, but special teams don't matter as much in the playoffs, and you sort of need to win in a different way. And so from that perspective, like as amazing as he is as an individual player, like that amazingness has not translated to the same level in the playoffs. Not saying he's still not a otherworldly player in the playoffs, but if he's not scoring 2 or 3 points a night, that team just can't win. And that's not really on him, but that's unfortunately how the team is constructed.
Yeah, it's like that extreme focus that comes in the playoffs, right? Where you can just really key in on somebody
Right.
over a 7-game series. It changes so much of the game, and I feel like in some ways it can be fun, like to watch a team like really key in on a star player and shut them down. But on the other hand, it's kind of like sad that that's what the sport kind of comes to. It's like how many guys can backpack onto Connor McDavid without getting a call and completely stop him from actually playing the game. But
Yeah,
that's where we are.
Besides obviously meeting with you, probably my favorite sort of like recording a podcast I ever did is a few years ago. I did a sort of classic game series with Court Snyder, who does people know him as the guy that does the manual tracking. And the game that we watched was like a game 6, Capitals versus Penguins. I want to say it was 2016. And I watched a few games of that series. And what was really interesting to me, obviously, you have two very talented teams. You have Crosby and Ovechkin on one side, but what determined that series was like the HBK line sort of going crazy and doing that. And Crosby and Malkin, maybe not playing the best that to their abilities at that point in time, but the adjustments that like Mike Sullivan was making, where I've rewinded like 4 or 5 times, just like how they adjusted the breakout in a very completely different way from like game one to like game six. And I asked like Sam Ventura, who's now with the Sabres, like was that true? He's like, yeah. We were definitely looking into some stuff like that. And it's like that is the stuff you need, where like you have the talent, but your system is flexible and strong enough to be able to support that talent when they are being held down. The team is focused all on them. Okay, cool. We have support mechanisms on the other side. So really good examples, obviously, like the Capitals power play. Everyone knows like Ovechkin is going to take that shot,
Yep.
but the Capitals have built in so many counters, from the bumper slide and all that stuff. Or you're going to like shadow Ovechkin. Great, we're going to play 4-on-3 and just kill you that way. That they've been consistently like top of the league for like an unprecedented amount of time because they are so smart about how they take advantage of you focusing on that one thing. And so that's the same thing, it's a little far afield from where the Canadians are, but hopefully when they get to that point, like this is the approach that, the GM can take in terms of building out the roster.
Yeah, there's like layers to plans, right?
Yeah.
And that's where like new thinking I think is heading, whereas like old school thinking is like we'll do it this way and it'll work
Right. Yeah.
some of the time.
Right.
Like the Canadians, not to like harp on them too much because they did just win a game, but like their
Right.
power play, it
Yeah.
hasn't really changed through multiple different coaches
Right.
for a long time. Like it's been essentially the same since like Andrei Markov was running it. It's just that now they don't have Andrei Markov, and
Right.
point shots aren't the way to score on the power play anymore. Like people look
Right.
back to like the 07-08 season, which was like when Guy Carbonneau was the coach, and that team like scored the lights out. I think they won the conference in the regular season. It was like a pretty low point total. Like it was very spread that year, but I believe they won the conference that year, and they
Yep.
did most of their work on the power play. And you watch that power play, and like today, I don't think it would be like a top 25 power play in the league. As
Right.
good as Andrei Markov was in his prime, it just like they were going for point shots all the time. That's all they wanted to do. And the game has changed so much. I know like working with like the more granular data, one of the things that I found super interesting starting with I think it was like the 2014-15 season is being
Mm.
able to look at like the average shot distance or like what percentage of shots come from what area,
Yeah.
and over from like 2014-15 to 2019-20, the percentage of shots that came from like the inner slot area, like just basically the net front, went
Right.
from like 12% to like 30% or something like that. It was
Right.
something crazy. It's like teams really did focus on like quality shots after it seemed like there was a when Corsi and Fenwick started to come about and be like generally accepted in the
Yeah.
NHL, you had teams like the LA Kings, right? They were just like absolutely dominant territorially, and they were shooting from everywhere. Most of their shots were pretty crappy, but they were so dominant and so good defensively that eventually they're going to win anyway. And
Right.
then that kind of like peaked out, and too many teams were playing that way, and then teams started to focus on quality shots, and then it like the passing through the middle became a big deal, getting to the net front, and not just as like a standing in front of the net type deal, but like getting shots from there, getting one-timers from the net front became a huge deal. And you can see that in the data. And I find that super interesting that you can actually follow where the league is going specifically from data.
Yeah, no, I mean it's interesting, and I've talked about this a lot. Like, what is the sort of corner 3-point shot for hockey, or what is spread formation for hockey or something like that, particularly at 5-on-5, that sort of unlocks um a new way of thinking about offense. The Houston Rockets a few years ago, just like we're going to shoot 43s a game, and the crazy part, to your point, was like the Kings, they weren't even making a lot of them. That was the part that people didn't understand. It was like Houston actually never really had people that were good at shooting threes, but they the math was just so much in their favor. Like you didn't even need the personnel to do it. It was just like it just made so much sense mathematically that you have to do it. And so it's like, what is that? In game theory, it's called the dominant strategy, which is like no matter what your opponent does, this is still the best thing for you to do, regardless. And so from that perspective, like I've been curious about the concept of like sort of vertical, sort of horizontal spacing, which is a lot of focus has been getting shots in the slot and sort of the sort of core home plate area, and obviously on the power play, which you see is something a little bit different, which is more like cross ice passes and all of that, and sort of forcing the goalies to move and then taking advantage of that movement and scoring off of like tic tac toe passes. And at 5-on-5, I'm more curious to see if, like, instead of focusing purely on getting the slots in the middle of the shot, shots in the middle in the slots, what if teams started focusing on? Because I do saw this on the NHL 22, so this is probably where I'm coming from. But focusing on like getting like rebounds on like very tight angles, and then uh, from one side, the goalie's, hugging the post on one side, you sort of shoot it off the pads, and now the sort of other side of the net is wide open, or you can sort of send the pass back if that's open. And now the goalie's going back and forth, and that sort of increases the likelihood that they can't stop one of those shots. I don't know if that's something like viable, but just watching a bunch of power plays, like uh, just seeing players like Marner and Panera, and just be able to sling those like passes across the ice with velocity and accuracy that no one else can do,
Right.
and like how much that opens up for other teammates of just like for someone else, you got to bobble the pass and that closes up that lane, but the pass like hits on the tape, and now you got like a 2-second window to make something happen that other players can't do. Like, how valuable is that for teams to be able to do that 5-on-5? And I think, to be honest, that's one of the things that the Canadians did today, but I think it's one of the things that they struggle with on a regular basis is that outside of drawing, as you said, Suzuki's not, he's a good playmaker. He'll make the sort of obvious plays and he'll make them well, but he won't create an advantage on his own. Jordan can make the plays, but once again, won't create an advantage on his own. Josh Anderson can create the advantage by his hard net driving, but can't take advantage of teams being out of position and setting someone else up, with his, particular gravity. So how do you sort of balance all that out and to create a roster that's better than the sum of its parts?
Yeah, it's tough, and I feel like as much as the last game was really rough, I think that Dominique Ducharme actually hit on something a little bit with his little switching up of the lines thing,
Yep.
because I think Arturi Lehkonen does a lot for that line to add some effort,
Right.
and splitting up Brendan Gallagher onto a different line from Lehkonen. It seemed like the Lehkonen, Evans, and Gallagher line was really dominating over the last stretch there. But it's one of those situations where, like, if you remove one of those guys, does it hurt the line that much? And
Exactly.
the answer was no. And it allowed them to bump Toffoli down to the Anderson and Dvorak line. And that line has been now incredible for 2 games in a row, despite how
Right.
awful the last game was. Like, Toffoli added a lot of it's weird because it's weird. You look at Tyler Toffoli and you don't think he's a great rush player, right? Because he's not the most
Yeah.
amazing skater, but
Yeah.
he's so smart with the puck and good at like alternating his speed a little bit to kind of force players to make like a checking attempt that then he'll find a way to beat them and get past them. That it creates more opportunities for Dvorak and more for Anderson to kind of like speed in and maybe hit him with a pass on a partial break. So that's worked out really well. And I like what Lehkonen brings to that Suzuki Caulfield line. It's not like he's going to add a lot of goal scoring, even though he did score tonight. But
Yeah.
he's a guy who's like a mucker that's going to get them the puck and insulate them a little bit defensively as well.
Yeah, I mean, what you said about the rush, and I say this all the time about McDavid, and people recognize that as well. Like, it's not some divine insight from me that Connor McDavid is a really good player. But what what it is, they talk about this like if you actually like scientifically break down like the Flash or Superman and running at like sonic speeds. It's basically be impossible for like a normal brain to process that much information that quickly. And so for Connor McDavid to, not only always have his foot on the gas, which I think is an important part. Like, yes, he's extremely fast, but he always has his foot on the gas. He's always take advantage of that speed in a way that other players are not taught to do on a regular basis and not allowed to do based on their coaching and systems. But then also being able to there's a reason why he's going through four, guys at once. It's not just because he's faster than all of them. You actually see he's subtly changing speeds as he's going through, but he also knows what speed to go. Like, okay, I go through here at like 10 miles per hour, and then like here through 20, and then back here through 15 because I need to slow down and trick the goalie and then like score. And I think that's the part that like really separates him from everybody else, even like generationally. And so, once again, you don't have to be the fastest guy, but if you can see like that opening and go in there, Barry Sanders, like the football running back, was the same way, where his straight line speed wasn't the fastest, but you see that hole and be able to get there before anybody else. And then once he's there, he's like, okay, I know what to do next, 2 steps before anybody else. And so, as Wayne Gretzky always said, it's like thinking faster instead of having to skate faster. And so, yeah,
Yeah, it's like that now pretty famous story of Connor McDavid where I think it was like a BioSteel sports camp and they did like just straight up sprinting with a bunch
sure,
of players and he finished like 6th out of the 25 or 30 players that they were doing. And then they had a test where you had to go like left or right and you would
right,
only know at the last second based on like a red or green light.
right, yeah,
And he blitzed everyone, right? So it was like
right,
it's the process of processing and reacting to information quicker than everyone else alongside the speed that makes him so special. And yeah, I think obviously not anywhere close to the same level, but Toffoli has like some level of that and what makes him a really decent rush player. For anything else for this game, I don't know if there's much else. I got totally off topic, but when I'm watching the game in the first period, my son watches with me now, and I
sure.
like take notes during the game. So sometimes he's like, I want to take notes too. And he drew me today on the notes. I don't know if you can see with the light. Is that gonna? It's too white. Here, let's see if I can.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Here we go. Let me just turn this. There we go.
There we
Yeah.
go.
So
Okay.
this is
Oh,
apparently me,
yes.
and this is my
Angry.
angry face when I put him in timeout like last week.
That should be the Canadians mascot. That right there.
Yeah, it's better than UP for sure. So he was like giving me shit while watching hockey. But yeah, we've got a young hockey fan on our hands there now. It's been 4 years in the making, but he's finally
Yes,
interested, which is kind of fun.
that's awesome.
Yeah, so hopefully I can get him to he seems to like the Montreal team, he says, but we'll see how that lasts.
It's not too late for him to reconsider.
Yeah.
Just like
Yeah.
I think about it all the time. It's like all of the crappy teams I support. Like, do I really want to pass that down? Like,
Yeah. Don't
you
make
have
decisions too early.
well, you have kids, and you want them to live a better life than you had. And I was like, I don't know if I want it to be that much better, but like, I also don't want them to suffer in the ways I have unnecessarily because I didn't know any better.
Yeah, absolutely. Was there anything else that stood out to the game, or maybe should we circle back on Gorton a little bit? 'Cause I think
Uh, I mean, no, I mean, obviously, sort of giving up two goals at the end. One, good for Crosby to sort of get off the schneid and
yeah, definitely.
get some positive wins in the scoring column. Yeah, I think he's been a little bit of a forgotten man with Ovechkin's chase. And I think, to be honest, like, sort of going into the realm of historically underrated. I think Connor McDavid is such a visually stunning player in terms of what he brings to the table that people like just purely look at the point totals of like Crosby in his first couple of years, and then look at his WAR impacts and all that stuff for like before they can even track them, but especially once he hit his prime. I think people are underrating how good of a player he was and sort of still is on the right night. So good for him. I think the announcer was talking about the Canadians are showing a little bit more compete now and all that stuff like that. I was like, I mean, when getting outshot by like 15, 20 shots, like,
Yeah,
I don't
they
know
allowed
that.
50 shots.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I
Like,
was like, yeah, it always looks a little bit different when a scoreboard is tilted in your favor. But that was probably something. Didn't I'm always curious about Nick Suzuki because I've probably been more down on him than most over the past couple of years. Didn't really stand out much to me. So yeah, so I'm curious to see that. I think Cole Caulfield had a pretty good night,
yeah.
and his line did pretty well overall. Sammy Niku had a pretty good night as well. So hopefully that can continue because you know going back to the early point about Josh Anderson, if this team is to break out where they are and to get back to a level of being in the playoffs and competing, the guys that are going to do it are, Suzuki, Josh Anderson just based on the length of his contract, Cole Caulfield, and then Sam Niku or some other sort of off the radar pick to sort of refill that blue line that desperately needs it. So the fact that they, for the most part, had a good game overall, hopefully this is the start of a longer term trend.
Yeah, I mean that would definitely be good for the Canadians. I know that there's a couple of people saying we should talk about Matthias Norlinder. I haven't looked at his like numbers tonight, but he did save that goal, which was nice. Like I think him getting like a highlight for a defensive play should go a little bit of a way to getting him a little bit more ice time. I know that the ice time overall tonight, I don't think he had a lot. It is one of those situations where you're like, what are you waiting for if you want to try this guy out? Like Caulfield only played 10 minutes. Wow, I thought that was a second period update. Hailing only 7 minutes. That's
Right.
more to be expected. Norlinder played 950. If you're not willing to play the young kid who you think is going to be a decently good prospect at this point in the season, when you heading into this one have won 5 out of 22 games, that speaks very poorly of what the coaching staff thinks of him.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and going back to the point we were talking about with Mark Bergevin, it's like, you always run the risk of a GM being on the last year of the contract and making sort of short-sighted moves to do this, to keep their job and all that. Same thing with coaches. And to me, like, in like my professional work setting, when you have like this sort of conflict of interest and constraints in place, I'm like, all right, well, you have to do this, but contingent on this, this, and this. So it's like, you have to, make us $1 million in revenue next year, but like you can't like cook the books to do it. Like it has to be like this particular way. It's the same way with like, developing prospects, particularly on a team that, as you said, is sort of really on the outside looking in on the playoff picture. Like, yes, great, you won a game today, but if the people who are going to win us a lot more games in the future than you likely are to as a coach for the next couple of years are not getting playing time and not developing correctly, then that's where you have to question: does this make sense? Is this the right approach? Is this the right person to lead us to that next level, or should we make a change there as well?
Yeah, and I think like the answer to that from our perspective is relatively obvious. And I mean, anytime you have a new GM come in, if you're bringing a coach that's from the last GM, there's a ticking clock, right? Unless you immediately win a Stanley Cup, like in Chicago, and like still you always heard about like Kenville and Bowman butting heads, but it lasted a long time because of the immediate success, right? So there's no immediate success coming right now. Maybe they'll be a little bit better next year, but this year is going to be a grind. I'll wrap it up because I've kept you way too long already, Chris, from the crash at the beginning, and I really appreciate you coming on. Before I let you go, tell everyone where they can find you because people need more Chris Watkins in their life.
Oh man, that sounds like a horrible, a horrible outcome. Yeah, I'm actually writing again for some reason. I have some hot takes and some thoughts. So I probably will post them on Hockey Graphs, although I am working on something else in the background. So hockeygraphs.com. You can follow me at yellow_pinato on Twitter. So wouldn't recommend doing that, but if you really hate yourself, then go ahead. I promise to be nice to Canadians fans because you all don't need any further misery being added by my part. So
this is true. No one needs to twist the knife right now. The Leafs fans are definitely trying to do that on their own.
Yes.
So yeah, thanks so much for joining me, Chris, and thanks everyone for tuning in and keeping with us through the crash and this horrible season that we're in the middle of. But hey, you got a nice win. You got a bunch of goals, and in Montreal, when they score more than 5 goals, they get free chicken wings at Casual Sport. So free chicken wings for everybody.